Polygraphs, more commonly known as lie detectors, were implemented into the criminal justice interrogation system in 1906. Originally, the polygraph machine used scrolling paper, time marker movements, and a needle with ink. Nowadays, the scrolling paper has been replaced with a computer monitor, and the scribbling ink needle has been replaced by complex algorithms. The computer monitor is connected to many probes and tubes that measure one's respiratory rate, blood pressure, and skin resistance.
We can see the way your heart rate changes. We can see the way your breathing changes. We can see the way your skin reflects. You actually will release more sweat in your finger glands when you tell a lie. There's things that go on that maybe science doesn't absolutely understand why, but it occurs. So that little feeling inside you when you're telling a lie, we get to see it on the screen. So even when you try.
Respiratory rate is measured by placing two pneumographs, tubes filled with air, around the subject's chest and abdomen. When one breathes, the chest and abdomen muscles expand, which displaces the air inside the tube. Blood pressure is measured the same way it would as if taken by a doctor, meaning a blood pressure cuff is placed around the upper arm of the subject. Lastly, skin resistance is measured by attaching galvanometers on two of the subject's fingers. Galvanometers are used to measure sweat production. Since the fingertips are the most porous and the easiest to detect sweat, the galvanometers are measured by the ability of the skin to conduct electricity. The wetter the fingertip, the higher the electricity reading. A typical polygraph test lasts 1.5 to 3 hours. This is because there are 3 different steps involved: the pre-test, the in-test, and the post-test. During the pre-test, there is a regular interview between the examiner and the subject. The examiner uses this time to get to know the subject and to visually analyze their behavior. They also formulate and review the questions they are going to ask during the polygraph test. They then tell the subject they are going to give them a polygraph test and ask if they would like to confess anything beforehand. They do this because the psychological warfare can cause them to change their response to each question.
Secretly love Riley?
No.
A little bit?
Just a little bit.
A little bit. Okay. Yeah, are you always nice to the other kids in your class?
Yes.
Not always?
Not always.
Next, they move on to the in-test. As it sounds, this is the part where the polygraph test begins. The examiner asks the subject a multitude of questions, beginning with basic control questions that lead into questions relevant to the situation.
Name Armstrong?
Yes.
Do you intend to answer truthfully each question regarding the stolen watch?
Yes.
A control question is a question that is so broad that almost anyone cannot say no. An example would be, have you ever stolen anything in your life? If the subject answers no, then the readings of that lie are referenced with the rest of the questions being asked. The last part of the test is the post-test. This is where the examiner analyzes the data and determines whether or not the subject is guilty or innocent. When reading the polygraph chart, each channel, respiratory rate, skin resistance, and blood pressure is scored individually. For any channel, if the control response has a greater peak than the relevant response, it has a score between +1 and +3 depending on the difference in magnitude of each peak. On the other hand, if the relevant response has a greater peak than the control response, it gets a score between -1 and -3. After all the channels have been tallied, all the scores from each channel are added together. If the final score is large and positive, it concludes the subject was truthful. If the final score was large and negative, it concludes the subject was being deceptive. Lastly, if the score was close to 0, the test is inconclusive.
We asked you, did the sex stain Sarah found in your bed come from another woman you had sex with? You said no. The lie detector determined that was a lie.